My mother sold me to a billionaire while I secretly took control of her life. They called me nobody and made me clean the house, completely unaware that I had $60 million and a list of every debt they owed. Tonight, the servants become masters, and I will watch them grovel for pocket money. But to understand how I've ruined their world, you have to go back to the exact moment the silence began. The heavy atmosphere of the library felt like a tomb as I retreated into the darkness, the stinging sensation on my cheeks a chilling reminder of the battle I was winning. I moved toward the only light remaining in the house, a solitary lighthouse in a sea of lies. The grandfather clock in the foyer of the Greystone estate struck 2 a.m., its rhythmic chime echoing through the cavernous hallways like a slow, deliberate heartbeat. I sat at my father's massive mahogany desk, the wood cold against my forearms, lit only by the amber glow of a single banker's lamp. Around me, the scent of expensive cigars and old paper clung to the curtains, the lingering aroma of men who believed their legacy was written in granite. I wasn't just cleaning tonight. I was the nobody daughter, the one Kemper designated as the unofficial night janitor of his pride. But he had grown too arrogant to realize what he was truly leaving behind. My grandfather used to say that a lion doesn't need to roar to prove its strength. It simply needs to know when to strike. Tonight, my strikes were silent, recorded in the margins of the forensic audit I was finalizing for Kemper Realty's hemorrhaging accounts. I traced the numbers with a steady finger, uncovering the exact $4.2 million deficit my father was frantically trying to hide behind offshore shell companies. I felt no burning hatred as I worked, only a profound, weary duty to the truth. Amidst the chaos of his debt, I found a tattered leather ledger belonging to my grandfather. I took a soft microfiber cloth and gently wiped away the dust, a silent vow to restore the honor that Kemper was so willing to trade for vanity. I found myself whispering a small prayer for my father's soul, hoping he might find the integrity to choose the right path before the ground gave way beneath him. But hope is a fragile thing in a house built on sand. I set the ledger down as the first gray light of dawn began to bleed through the heavy velvet curtains. Have you ever trusted someone you shouldn't have, only to realize the person who needs to save you is yourself? The silence of the early morning was shattered by the sharp click of designer heels. Arias swept into the room, a cloud of expensive French perfume trailing behind her like a poisonous mist. She didn't look at me. She looked at the desk, her eyes widening as she saw the completed debt restructuring proposal I had spent 48 hours perfecting. It was a masterpiece of legal maneuvering, a surgical plan to save the estate without sacrificing the workers' pensions. "I'll take that," Arias sneered, snatching the files before the ink was even dry. Her entitlement was a physical weight in the room. I stood up slowly, my legs stiff from the night's labor. "Arias, that plan is delicate," I said, my voice maintaining a steady, calm resonance. "It requires a surgical understanding of Connecticut's commercial laws. If you take it without understanding the soul behind those figures, you'll only accelerate the collapse." She laughed, a hollow, brittle sound. Before she could retort, the door swung open and Kemper entered. He looked disheveled, the skin beneath his eyes sagging with the weight of impending ruin. Arias didn't hesitate. She held up my work with a triumphant smile. "Look, Father, I've been up all night. I've found the genius breakthrough we needed to save the firm." Kemper's eyes flickered with a desperate false hope as he reached for the documents. I looked at him, not with the anger he expected, but with a deep, aching pity. I saw a man drowning, grabbing at shadows instead of the hand trying to pull him to shore. "Father, let me walk you through the data," I offered softly. "There are risks in Section 4 that need your attention." "Stay in your lane, Dahlia," Kemper snapped, his voice rough from lack of sleep. Arias smirked, tucking my intellectual heart and soul under her arm as if it were a common accessory. In that moment, I realized I was treated as an intruder in the very home I was trying to keep afloat. "You're a maid, Dahlia," Arias added, her voice dripping with mock sympathy. "Go clean the kitchen floor and stay out of adult business." This is for the people who actually have a future in this family." I didn't move. I stood there, rooted in my own self-respect. "The plan won't work without my oversight, Arias. You're playing with fire you don't know how to extinguish." Kemper's face flushed a deep, angry crimson. The stress of his failing empire and the poison in Arias's ear finally boiled over. He crossed the distance between us in 2 strides. The slap was sharp and sudden, a stinging explosion against my cheek that echoed off the mahogany walls. My head snapped to the side. The room went deathly silent. I didn't cry. I didn't scream. I slowly turned my face back to him, my eyes as cold and unforgiving as a Greenwich winter. In that stinging heat, I realized the man who had raised me was gone, replaced by a ghost of pure, unadulterated ego. I understood then that forgiveness isn't about welcoming someone back into your heart. It's about realizing they no longer have the authority to ruin your peace. That slap was the final signature on my emotional divorce from the Kemper bloodline. "I hope you find what you're looking for, Father," I said, the words falling like ice. I turned and walked out, leaving them to their stolen prize. I climbed the narrow stairs to my cramped attic room, the sting on my face a badge of clarity. I sat on the edge of my thin mattress and opened my encrypted laptop. The screen glowed, illuminating a digital bank statement that verified the $60 million inheritance my grandfather had secured for me. I wasn't an outcast. I wasn't a servant. I was the architect of the reckoning they couldn't see coming. I typed a single message to Garrison and hit send. "The harvest is ready. Let the winter begin." The morning mist over the Greenwich shoreline had long burned away, replaced by a sun so bright it felt intrusive. It glinted off the polished silver trays, and the crystal flutes scattered across the manicured gardens of the gray stone estate. White silk canopies billowed in the soft breeze, looking like pristine sails of a fleet that was, in reality, taking on water. I stood near the edge of the terrace, the weight of the silver tray in my hands a familiar burden, while the simple fabric of my maid's uniform chafed against my skin. Just a few feet away, Arias was the center of a laughing circle. Her designer dress a vibrant splash of color that cost more than a year of my official wages. The juxtaposition was almost comedic. She looked like a queen, while I moved like a ghost through a crowd that looked right through me. I didn't mind the invisibility. It was my greatest asset. It allowed me to hear the whispers Kemper didn't want the world to know. I watched my father move from group to group, his laughter a bit too loud, his gestures a bit too wide. He was boasting about a major acquisition in the Midwest. But as I calculated the interest rates of the predatory mezzanine loans he'd taken out last month, I saw the truth. He wasn't celebrating a victory. He was performing a high society funeral for his own reputation, using the last of his liquidity to buy one more afternoon of relevance. An elderly waiter named Arthur stumbled slightly as he carried a heavy tray of hors d'oeuvres toward the West Wing guests. I stepped in before anyone noticed his fatigue, quietly taking the tray from his trembling hands. "Rest your legs for a moment, Arthur," I whispered, offering him a small, genuine smile. "I've got this side covered." Kindness in this house felt like an act of rebellion. I wasn't being weak. I was preserving the only part of myself that Kemper hadn't tried to auction off yet. My grandfather once told me that you can tell the true character of a person by how they treat those who can do absolutely nothing for them. Looking at the hollow shells of the people surrounding me, I understood that I was the wealthiest person in this garden, regardless of the bank statement on my phone. The air shifted as Arias noticed my movement. She was surrounded by her socialite friends, her voice rising to a sharp, performative pitch. "Oh, look, everyone," she said, her eyes gleaming with a predatory light. "Dahlia is finally making herself useful. Honestly, I don't know what we'd do without her. She has such a natural talent for service, doesn't she?" She was looking for a reaction, a crack in my stoic mask. When I didn't give it to her, she decided to create a moment she thought I couldn't ignore. She turned toward the wife of an influential investor, a woman named Mrs. Sterling, whose firm was currently being circled by my own private fund. With a flick of her wrist that was far too deliberate to be an accident, Arias tipped her glass. A deep, blood-red Cabernet Sauvignon cascaded over Mrs. Sterling's white leather shoes. The silence that followed was heavy and sudden, the kind of quiet that precedes a landslide. Arias didn't apologize. Instead, she pointed a manicured finger at the grass near her feet. "Dahlia, come here immediately," she commanded, her voice ringing out across the lawn. "You're the cleaning expert, aren't you? Get down there and fix Mrs. Sterling's shoes. Now. We can't have our guests looking like a mess because of your slow service." I felt every eye in the garden turn toward me. The nobody daughter, called to heel like a disobedient hound. Mrs. Sterling looked uncomfortable, her face flushing with embarrassment. But Arias doubled down. "Go on, Dahlia. My sister loves being useful. It's her only real talent, after all." I walked toward them, my face a mask of cold, unyielding stone. From the corner of my eye, I saw Velma watching from the terrace. My mother didn't intervene. She simply took a sip of her drink and nodded, her silent approval of my public execution cutting deeper than any of Arias's words. I sank to my knees on the lush grass. The dampness of the soil seeped into my uniform, but I didn't flinch. I took a linen napkin and began to wipe the expensive wine from Mrs. Sterling's shoes. As I worked, Arias reached out and placed her heel firmly on my shoulder, ostensibly to steady herself as she laughed at a joke one of her friends made. The humiliation was visceral, public, and absolute. I could feel the heat of the sun on the back of my neck and the cold weight of Arias's foot on my skin. Would you have stayed silent and played the part? Or would you have burned the bridge before you even crossed it? I finished the task with a precision that was chilling. I stood up slowly, meeting Mrs. Sterling's gaze. Her eyes were filled with pity, but mine were filled with a clarity she couldn't possibly understand. "I hope your afternoon remains as spotless as your shoes, Mrs. Sterling," I said, my voice hauntingly graceful. I didn't look at Arias. I didn't give her the satisfaction of a tear or a trembled lip. As I walked away, a quote I'd read once echoed in my mind. "A person's worth isn't defined by the dirt they clean, but by the dignity they keep while doing it." I had already noted Mrs. Sterling's name. Her firm was one of the 3D Legacy was negotiating to acquire by the end of the quarter. I slipped into the quiet shadows of the kitchen, finding Arthur leaning against a counter. I pulled a small envelope from my pocket, half of my maid's wages I'd saved over the months. I pressed it into his hand. "Find a better place, Arthur," I told him, my voice low and urgent. "The foundation of this house is already turning to dust. You shouldn't be here when it collapses." I retreated to the service entrance and checked my phone. A message from Garrison sat waiting on the encrypted app. "The banks are officially asking questions about Kemper's liquidity. The trap is closing, Dahlia. They're desperate." A small, cold smile touched my lips. "Let them play king today," I whispered to the empty hallway. "Tomorrow I become the taxman." I looked back through the glass doors at the laughing crowd, Arias still preening like a queen on her makeshift throne. I wasn't quailing at her feet. I was simply measuring the height from which she was destined to fall. Every laugh they shared was a debt they couldn't afford to pay, and I was the one holding the ledger. The sun began to dip behind the oaks, casting long, distorted shadows across the lawn. The facade of grandeur was still intact, but I could hear the microscopic cracks forming in the silence. It wasn't just a party. It was the beginning of the end. The cold autumn rain didn't just fall. It lashed against the windows of the small cottage at the edge of the estate, sounding like gravel thrown against glass. I sat by the modest hearth, stirring a pot of simple vegetable soup. The aroma was earthy and honest, a stark contrast to the heavy, suffocating scents of French perfume and expensive scotch that defined the main house. Here, in Garrison's home, I wasn't Dahlia the maid. I was just a woman finding a moment of peace. Garrison watched me from his worn armchair, his eyes sharp despite his age. He noticed the way I favored my left side, the subtle wince when I reached for a ladle. He didn't ask, but I saw the sorrow in his gaze. He knew the physical cost of my servant life. I offered him a weary smile, trying to bridge the gap between us. The scars we can't see are the ones that define us, Garrison. These bruises, they'll fade by morning. Character is much harder to mend. He reached out, his hand steady and warm on my arm. You've got your grandfather's fire, Dahlia. He always said the finest steel has to go through the hottest forge. I felt overwhelmed. Garrison was my only anchor, the only one who still remembered the girl I once was, before I became a burden to my own family. I treated him with the calmness and patience of a daughter protecting the last piece of her father's legacy. In this small, dim space, the world seemed to be understood. Then, the flashing blue lights of reality cut through the wet darkness of the driveway. The sudden rhythmic pulse of police sirens shattered the peace. I stood up, my heart hammering against my ribs. Kemper and Velma stepped out of a black SUV, shielding themselves from the rain with large umbrellas. They didn't look like worried parents. They looked like executioners. Velma marched toward the door, her face contorted into a mask of theatrical distress. "Officer, he's in there! The man who betrayed our trust!" she cried, pointing a trembling finger at Garrison. The door was kicked open. 2 officers pushed past me, their boots tracking mud and rain across the clean floors I had polished just yesterday. Velma stood in the center of the small room, claiming Garrison had stolen a set of heirloom silver spoons and a rare coin collection from the main house. It was a lie so brazen it left me breathless. Old men get desperate when they realize they've been forgotten. Kemper sneered from the doorway, his silhouette blocking out the night. I watched in a state of icy horror as an officer reached under Garrison's mattress and pulled out a small velvet pouch. It was a plant. A clumsy, cruel setup. "Garrison didn't do this!" I shouted, my voice cracking the heavy tension. "You put that there!" Kemper didn't even look at me. He just watched the officers lead Garrison toward the door. The sight of his frail wrists in handcuffs sparked a protective rage in me that I had never felt before. But I knew Kemper. This wasn't just about a few silver spoons. This was a move on the chessboard. In the drenching rain outside, Kemper pulled me into the shadow of the porch. The air smelled of wet earth and his expensive cigars, a scent that now made my stomach turn. He pulled 2 legal folders from his coat, protected by plastic sleeves. They were a quitclaim deed and an inheritance waiver. "Sign these," he demanded, his voice low and gravelly. "Sign away any claim to the estate, the trust, and the name. Do it now, and the charges against the old man vanish into the night. We'll tell the police it was a misunderstanding. If you refuse, Garrison spends the rest of his life in a state penitentiary." I looked at Garrison, who was being forced into the back of a squad car. Through the rain-streaked window, he saw us. He shook his head frantically, his lips moving in a silent, "Don't." He was willing to go to prison to save my future, but I couldn't let him. Real love isn't about what you're willing to take. It's about what you're willing to lose to keep someone else's light from going out. I understood the legal trap Kemper was setting. Under US law, these documents would effectively make me a ghost, a person with no standing to contest the rot he was creating. My hand didn't tremble as I reached for his pen. I looked Kemper in the eye, seeing the hollow, desperate man he had become. "You've won the paper, Kemper," I said, my voice a chilling whisper that seemed to cut through the rain. "But you've just lost the only soul who would have stayed with you when the real storm hits." I signed the documents. The ink felt like a death warrant for my past. I handed them back, watching as Kemper tucked them away like a predator with a fresh kill. He gave a sharp whistle to the officers. Within minutes, the handcuffs were removed, and Garrison was left standing in the rain, trembling and weeping with shame. Velma made a show of patting Garrison's shoulder for the benefit of the officers, playing the role of the merciful matriarch. "We won't press charges this time, but you must leave the estate. We can't have thieves near Dahlia." The cruelty was absolute. They had stripped him of his home and me of my legal identity in a single coordinated strike. Garrison clung to me as the cars drove away, his tears mixing with the rain. "I'm so sorry, Dahlia. You shouldn't have done it. Your grandfather's legacy." "The legacy isn't in a piece of paper, Garrison," I told him, holding him tight. "It's in us." Later that night, I sat on the cold floor of my attic room. I looked at an old, faded photograph of my grandfather. I felt a heavy ache in my chest, a mixture of empowerment and quiet grief. I had just committed an emotional divorce from my parents. Under Connecticut law, a contract signed under such blatant duress is voidable. But I wouldn't use that card yet. I needed them to feel safe. I needed them to believe they had finally buried me. I opened my laptop and sent a single encrypted file to a server in the Cayman Islands. It contained the video evidence of the night's events, recorded from the pinhole camera I'd hidden in Garrison's cottage weeks ago. "I'm sorry I had to play their game for a moment, Grandpa," I whispered into the dark. "But sometimes you have to let the enemy think they've captured the pawn to realize you've already taken their king." Downstairs, I heard the faint pop of a champagne cork. My parents were celebrating my erasure. They didn't realize that by cutting the last tie of blood and obligation, they had given me the ultimate freedom. I no longer owed them mercy. I no longer owed them a daughter's love. I was a sovereign entity now, and my reckoning would be as cold and relentless as the winter they didn't see coming. The morning following the extortion felt heavy, the air in the Greystone estate thick with a smug, artificial triumph. I moved through the shadows of the hallway, my footsteps silent on the marble. Downstairs, the muffled sound of my father's laughter drifted up, punctuated by the clinking of crystal. They were celebrating a victory over a ghost. They believed they had finally stripped me of my name and my future, unaware that they had only succeeded in cutting the final thread of my hesitation. By noon, the house shifted into a different kind of theater. I was summoned to my mother's master suite. The room was a monument to excess. Silk-draped walls, oversized mirrors, and a scent of lilies that felt more like a funeral parlor than a bedroom. Velma lay in the center of her massive bed, clutching a lace handkerchief to her chest, surrounded by expensive, half-empty pill bottles and a fake heart monitor that hummed a rhythmic lie. She was putting on a performance of impending death. I brought her a glass of water, standing by the bedside with a mask of dutiful concern. I watched the monitor. The jagged green line on the screen didn't match the steady, calm pulse I could see thrumming in her neck. It was a masterpiece of manipulation. A mother's love is the first gift we receive, but a mother's betrayal is the final lesson we must learn to survive. She was weaponizing my supposed compassion, betting on the girl she thought still lived inside me. "Dahlia," she whispered, her voice a fragile rasp. "I only trust you. Your father, Arias. They are too emotional. I need my responsible daughter to handle my affairs if my heart fails." She produced a stack of documents. Medical care directives, she called them. But tucked deep within the legal jargon, hidden behind clauses of care and comfort, was a durable power of attorney. Under U.S. law, signing it would grant the family immediate access to any financial assets tied to my legal identity. My forensic training caught the snare instantly. They were trying to claw back the very inheritance they had just forced me to waive, hoping I was too broken to notice the fine print. I took the pen she offered. My hand was as steady as a surgeon's. Using a specific disappearing ink pen I had prepared for this very moment, I signed with a slight legal variation that would render the document non-notarizable upon closer inspection. I leaned down and kissed her cool, dry forehead. "I will give you exactly what you deserve, Mother," I whispered. She smiled, a predatory gleam in her eyes, believing she had finally enslaved my future. I walked out of that room and climbed the narrow, creaking stairs to my attic. My sanctuary was small, dusty, and smelled of old wood, but it was the only honest place in this house. I checked my phone immediately. A notification from the hidden pinhole camera in my room showed Arya sneaking inside while I was with Velma. She was moving with a frantic, jealous energy, lifting my thin mattress and tucking a rare canary diamond necklace, worth at least $50,000, deep into the stuffing. I watched the feed with the cold clarity of a mathematician. There was no anger, only a weary confirmation of their nature. There is a famous saying that when your enemy is making a mistake, you should never interrupt them. Arya's wanted to frame me for theft to ensure I was physically removed from the estate. She wanted me in a cell, far away from the secrets she feared I still held. I entered the room 10 minutes after she left. I pulled the necklace from the mattress. I didn't keep it. Instead, I reached into my floorboard and pulled out a thick folder of Kemper's internal company tax records, the ones Garrison helped me retrieve, showing $2 million in offshore tax evasion. I slipped the folder exactly where the diamonds had been and moved the necklace to Arias's own jewelry box downstairs. When Arias returned an hour later, bringing Kemper and a look of feigned shock to discover the stolen goods, she reached into my bed with a triumphant cry. But she didn't pull out diamonds. She pulled out the very evidence that could put her father in federal prison for the next decade. The silence that followed was deafening. Arias stood frozen, clutching the tax documents as Kemper's face turned a ghastly shade of gray. I looked at her, seeing the terror in her eyes as the trap she built snapped shut on her own father. "I was looking for a reason to believe you were better than this, sister," I said softly. "Thank you for making my choice easier." I showed no malice, only the deep disappointment of a soul that had hoped for a shred of goodness and found only rot. Kemper snatched the documents, his hands trembling as he realized his daughter had just exposed his greatest crime in an attempt to bury me. He began to burn the papers in the fireplace, unaware that digital copies were already resting in a secure legal vault halfway across the world. Have you ever wondered if you'd have the stomach to stay in a house that tries to bury you every single day? I retreated to my desk and opened an encrypted link to Garrison. The data was clear. Kemper's credit score had officially plummeted to subprime. The interest rates on his debt were skyrocketing, and the D Legacy Fund now held 70% of his total liabilities. I was no longer just the maid or the outcast daughter. I was the primary creditor for the very roof over their heads. I gazed out the small attic window, watching the Greenwich skyline. They thought they were trapping me in a cage of rules and lies, but they didn't know that I was the one who wrote those rules. I was the only one who knew where the exit was. Arias looked at the empty mattress where she thought she had hidden my tragic fate, her face pale with a horror she couldn't name. She didn't realize that by trying to steal my freedom, she had just given me the key to the entire kingdom. The Manhattan rain blurred the city lights into jagged streaks of neon as the black sedan pulled up to the curb. Inside, the air was cold and smelled of Arias's sharp perfume and the suffocating weight of expectation. I was wearing a dress Arias had chosen, a piece of silk that felt more like a costume than clothing, designed to make me look like a compliant ornament. My father, Kemper, sat beside me, his fingers drumming a nervous, erratic rhythm on his leather briefcase. He didn't look at me. He looked through me, staring at a future he was trying to buy with a currency he didn't own. We were led into a private, dimly lit VIP room at an ultra-exclusive steakhouse. The walls were paneled in dark wood, and the atmosphere was thick with the scent of expensive cigars and a desperate, lingering ambition. Across the table sat Mr. Thorne, a billionaire whose reputation for predatory acquisitions was matched only by the whispered rumors of his cruelty. The way he looked at me made my skin crawl. It was the look of a man appraising a piece of real estate he intended to demolish. I sat in silence, observing the subtle tremor in Kemper's hands as he poured the wine. I could see the predatory nature of the contract resting between them. This wasn't a business meeting to save Kemper Realty. This was a liquidation sale. Kemper wasn't looking for a partner. He was looking for a way to trade his youngest daughter for a stay of execution from his creditors. My grandfather always warned me that money could buy a house, but it could never buy the home inside a person's soul. I felt a profound, hollow pity for the man sitting next to me. He believed that selling my life would somehow exorcise the ghosts of his own failures. The negotiation was a suffocating dance of numbers and veiled threats. Thorne reached across the table, his hand lingering on my arm with a sickening familiarity. Kemper didn't flinch. He didn't even blink. He simply smiled, a hollow, ghastly expression, and raised his glass. "To the future of our families," he declared, his voice a brittle echo of authority that didn't reach his eyes. Then the announcement rang out, like a blow to my heart. Kemper looked at Thorne, then at me, with a fake warmth that made me nauseous. "As part of the capital restructuring agreement, Dahlia has gladly agreed to join our family through a formal engagement. In essence, it's a merger of interests. It was a modern-day human trafficking, a transaction disguised under the guise of upper-class tradition." Velma, sitting next to Kemper, leaned forward and nodded vigorously. "It's time you did something useful for the Kemper bloodline. Don't be selfish anymore." I looked Kemper directly in the eye, my voice a calm, steady anchor in the midst of their madness. "Is the foundation of this family so rotted that you truly believe my life is the only thing left to hold up the walls, Father?" It wasn't a plea. It was a devastating observation of his moral bankruptcy. The silence that followed was heavy, broken only by the distant hum of the city and the sound of my own steady breathing. That silence, it hurt more than any words could. Have you ever been betrayed by the one person who was supposed to protect you? Kemper's face shifted, the feigned warmth evaporating into a cold, jagged desperation. He realized I wasn't the compliant child he needed for this theater. He leaned in, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "I know about your little chats with Garrison, Dahlia. I know you've been communicating with that D-Legacy fund. You think you're clever, stealing family secrets? I have the papers ready. Sign over the access to those accounts, or I'll have you committed to a private psychiatric ward by morning. Delusional behavior is a very hard thing to disprove when your own father is the witness." He believed he had found my breaking point. He thought the threat of an asylum would force me to hand over the keys to the kingdom I had spent years building, but his greed had made him reckless. The darkest hour is indeed just before the dawn, but only if you have the courage to walk through the night without flinching. I took a slow, deliberate sip of my water, watching him. His legal threat was flimsy, a desperate gamble built on a foundation of lies. I had already secured the evidence of his extortion. I stood up, my composure so absolute it seemed to radiate a cold light. Thorne shifted uncomfortably, and Kemper's eyes widened as I looked down at them both. I didn't feel like a victim. I felt like a judge. "The deal is done, Kemper," I said, my voice cutting through the room like a blade. "But not the one you think you've made. You've traded your last shred of humanity for a seat at a table that will never truly welcome you." I turned and walked out of the restaurant, leaving the smell of cigars and rot behind. The Manhattan rain felt clean against my skin as I stepped onto the sidewalk. I pulled my earpiece from my bag, and Garrison's voice crackled through the line, steady and reassuring. "The freeze orders are ready, Dahlia. The banks are waiting for the final signature. Just say the word." I gazed up at the towering skyscrapers, their light reflecting off the wet pavement. I was no longer the cleaning girl or the debt-ridden scapegoat. I was the storm maker. Kemper raised his glass in that room, toasting a billionaire's promise, completely unaware that the glass in his hand was the last thing he would ever truly own in this city. The Manhattan rain was a memory by the time the elevator doors slid open on the 39th floor of a steel and glass tower in downtown Boston. I stepped out into this quiet, clinical hum of the D Legacy headquarters, the soles of my heels clicking against the polished stone with a predatory rhythm. I had shed the silk dress Thorne appraisingly stared at, replacing it with a tailored charcoal suit that felt like armor. I stood before the floor-to-ceiling windows, looking out at the sprawling skyline. I wasn't the nobody servant or the sacrificial daughter anymore. I was the titan my grandfather always knew I would become. Garrison stood by the primary terminal, his face illuminated by the blue glow of a dozen monitors. He didn't say a word, but the slight nod he gave me was a silent acknowledgement of the shift in the atmosphere. The time for observation was over. The time for the digital siege had arrived. I looked at the scrolling data of Kemper Realty's liabilities, seeing the red ink bleed across the screen like a fresh wound. They're leveraging the Greenwich estate to cover the short-term interest on the Thorne loan, Garrison noted, his voice steady. They have no idea the loan was sold to us 2 hours ago. I sat at the central console, my fingers hovering over the keys. Under U.S. commercial law, the D Legacy Fund now held the recall clauses for every major debt Kemper possessed. With a single deliberate keystroke, I authorized the immediate freeze of all Kemper Realty operational accounts. The legal basis was irrefutable, a material breach of covenant and an absolute risk of insolvency. True power isn't about the noise you make, but the silence you can impose on those who thought they were untouchable. I watched the numbers on the screen begin to collapse, calculating exactly how many minutes remained before the lights went out at Greystone. A sudden alert flashed on the secondary monitor. A personal charity account belonging to Velma was being swept into the freeze. I paused, my finger hovering over the override. I saw the line items for an orphanage in the city she had sponsored for years. Despite her cruelty toward me, that small pocket of her soul still held a fragment of goodness. I manually whitelisted the account. I am stripping their pride, Garrison, not their potential for good, I whispered. He didn't argue. He understood that my justice was surgical, not blind. The high-velocity pulse of the server room felt like my own heartbeat. I was the Shadow CEO, and my siege was invisible and absolute. Have you ever lost everything? Your reputation? Your family's trust? Only to find a version of yourself that was stronger than any lie they could tell? While the digital walls closed in on Kemper's empire, the Greystone estate was descending into a frantic, ugly chaos. My hidden cameras showed Kemper in his office, red-faced and screaming into a dead phone line. His corporate credit cards were being declined. The private staff was already walking out as their paychecks bounced. Outside, the leased Ferrari sat motionless in the driveway because the contract had been revoked for non-payment. Aria's was hysterical, her voice a shrill, desperate sound as she begged a bank teller for a grace period that didn't exist. Backed into a corner, Kemper tried to play his final, dirtiest card. Within the hour, a forged document was leaked to the local Greenwich press. It claimed that I, Dahlia, had embezzled millions from my grandfather's estate to fund a delusional lifestyle and shady investments. He attempted to file an emergency petition with the Connecticut probate court to invalidate my legal standing as an heir. He was trying to murder my character to save his cash. I watched the news report scroll across my tablet. The betrayal of my character was meant to be the final strike, the one that would break my will. I recalled a truth my grandfather whispered to me long ago. The truth doesn't need to shout to be heard. It just needs to wait for the lies to run out of breath. I felt no panic, only a cold, hard resolution. Instead of a counter lawsuit, which would take months, I gave Garrison the signal. We released a pre-recorded video of my grandfather, filmed in his final months. In the video, he clearly explained the nature of my inheritance, the reasons for his secrecy, and his profound lack of trust in Kemper's management. I used the truth as a shield. not a sword. I refused to be dragged into their mud. I maintained my dignity while they lost theirs in a public spectacle of greed and desperation. The evening before the birthday gala, the office phone rang. It was Kemper. His voice was no longer commanding. It was a broken, jagged sound. He didn't apologize for the asylum threat or the forged documents. He asked for a loan, a temporary bridge to keep the gala afloat for the sake of the family's survival. He was still lying to me, still pretending the party was anything more than a desperate attempt to look successful one last time. I listened to him breathe on the other end of the line. A part of me wanted to end it then, to let him sit in the dark. But I realized that sometimes you have to give someone the stage they want, so the world can see the play they've actually written. "The funds for the gala will be released, Kemper," I said, my voice calm and devoid of emotion. "It will be exactly as you planned." I hung up, knowing that this party would be the final act of their dynasty. Garrison warned me that Kemper was still planning to have me committed to a ward the moment the party ended. He had already contacted a private facility. I smiled sadly at the irony. "He is trying to lock the door to a house that I already own the keys to," I said. "Let him have his party. It will be the most expensive birthday in history." I stood by the window as the sun set over Boston, the sky turning a bruised shade of purple. I felt a strange mixture of quiet confidence and a lingering melancholy. I looked at the shimmering, emerald green dress hanging on the office door. A dress I had bought with my own hard-earned legacy. Tomorrow, I wouldn't be the daughter cleaning the floors or the girl being traded like a commodity. I would be the woman owning the very foundation they stood on. The highest price a person can pay is their own pride. They spent years trying to make me feel small, but they only succeeded in making me invincible. As the city lights began to twinkle at my feet, I felt the burden of the past finally begin to dissipate. Judgment was no longer a promise. It had arrived. The heavy oak doors of the grand ballroom swung open, revealing a world that had tried to bury me. Inside, the Greystone estate breathed with an artificial, feverish life. Hundreds of Greenwich's elite drifted through the room, their silhouettes reflected in the massive crystal chandeliers that hung like frozen tears from the ceiling. The air was thick with the scent of lilies and expensive champagne, a fragrant shroud for the rot I knew lay just beneath the surface. I stood at the threshold, not in the gray maid's uniform they forced me to wear for years, but in a structured, silk suit of deep charcoal. It felt like armor. I didn't enter with a shout. I entered with the absolute, terrifying silence of the truth. The music faltered. The rhythmic clinking of glasses slowed to a crawl. A confused, heavy stillness swept through the ballroom as the nobody servant they had mocked walked toward the center of the room with the grace of a sovereign reclaiming a stolen throne. Kemper stood on the velvet-draped stage, a crystal flute raised high. He was mid-toast, spinning a web of lies about resilience and a new offshore merger. Velma and Arius stood beside him, draped in emeralds and pearls bought with money I knew they no longer possessed. I looked at my father, and for a fleeting second, I felt a crushing weight of sadness. Dignity isn't something you can take from someone. It's something you lose the moment you try to steal it from others. He was a man drowning in his own vanity, and the lights were about to go out. I reached the foot of the stage, my eyes fixed on the man who had tried to trade my life for his debt. The loudest room is always the one where the truth has just arrived. I gave a subtle nod to Garrison, who stood in the control booth, his face a steady anchor in the sea of faces. With a single movement, the promotional video of Kemper's fake success cut to a stark black screen. Suddenly, a verified bank statement from a Tier 1 Swiss institution appeared on the 20-foot LED display. The numbers were massive, cold, and irrefutable. Current balance, $60 million. Account holder, Dahlia Whitmore. The gasps that rippled through the ballroom were sharp, like the sound of breaking glass. Before Kemper could find his voice, I pulled a leather-bound folder from my side. This house you stand in, the company you claim to lead, and the very air you breathe in, this room, I bought it all, I said, my voice carry across the silent hall without effort. Kemper Realty didn't find a merger. It was liquidated and acquired by the D Legacy Fund. I am your primary creditor, Kemper, and I've come to collect. The elite of Greenwich watched in a state of paralysis as I presented the grant deeds and the foreclosure notices. Velma's glass hit the floor, shattering into 1,000 diamonds of light. Aria's began to scream, her voice high and frantic, claiming it was a forgery. I stood my ground, a mask of stoic justice. Numbers don't lie, Arias. Only people do. I didn't stay silent for 3 years because I was weak. I stayed silent because I wanted to see if any part of this family was worth saving. Today, I finally have my answer. I didn't throw them into the night. That would have been too easy, a momentary cruelty that lacked the weight of real justice. I produced the restructuring plan. You will move into the servants' quarters in the attic, I announced, looking at my parents. You will receive an allowance of $15 an hour, the exact wage you deemed plenty for me. You will learn the value of $1 you actually earn. I turned to Garrison and handed him a heavy set of brass keys. Garrison, you are the new estate manager. My parents and Arias will report to you for their daily chores. I want them to have a roof over their heads, but they will no longer have the luxury of their lies. A profound sense of peace began to spread through my chest. A quiet liberation I hadn't felt since my grandfather passed. I realized then that I didn't want this mansion. I didn't want to live in a gray stone prison built on a foundation of betrayal. True wealth isn't about owning the house. It's about being the person who can walk away from it without looking back. I turned my back on the ballroom, on the emeralds, and on the ghosts of a dynasty that had just breathed its last. As I walked to the car where Garrison was waiting, I paused by the plum tree my grandfather had planted when I was born. I reached out and took a single, waxy leaf, a tangible memory of the only real love I had ever known in this place. Your legacy is safe, Grandpa, I whispered into the wind. Not because of the 60 million, but because I finally know who I am. I closed the car door, the muffled sounds of the ballroom fading into a distant, hollow echo. I didn't feel like I had won a war. I felt like I had finally woken up from a long, suffocating nightmare, and the sun was just beginning to rise over the horizon. I looked at the road ahead, realizing that the most powerful thing I possessed wasn't the money in the bank, but the freedom to never return. Have you ever lived through something like this? I know many of you have been there, betrayed, overlooked, or treated like you didn't matter. Tell me, what was the moment you finally decided to choose yourself? I'd love to read your stories in the comments.